There's no mistaking that sound. It's the sound of one of the most popular and useful power tools, and one of the most potentially dangerous.
I was cutting a half-inch piece of plywood for a floorboard in my boat with a circular saw, and I didn't have it clamped down properly. Well, the wood shifted on me, and the saw came down across my leg and cut a really deep gash in my leg. I went to the hospital. After a lot of surgery, a lot of stitches, they finally repaired my leg.
Each year, serious injuries are attributable to accidents with circular saws. And as tragic as this is, these accidents need not happen. Whether it's in the home workshop or on the professional construction site, when a circular saw is properly operated and maintained, the chances of accidental injury are virtually eliminated. PTI, the Power Tool Institute, is committed to ensuring injury-free operation of power tools. In cooperation with member companies, PTI has produced this presentation on the safe operation of circular saws. You'll hear from a number of power tool experts who will provide you with the guidance and information you need to not only effectively operate a circular saw, but to do so safely. Of course, this presentation is not meant to replace the information and advice contained in your circular saw operator's manual. Be sure to completely read the manual before using your saw. It's also the first place to look if you have any questions. As with using any other power tool, safe operation begins with a work area that is free from potential hazards and an operator who is properly prepared.
There are several things that I would do before I get started with the work itself. I want the work site to be clean and neat. I don't want extraneous things around that were left over from the last project or the children's toys that are in the way. This is a workshop now, and I have to make it as a workshop. Very clean, very straight.
Looking at the work area, avoiding clutter is an issue, so that you don't, so that you do maintain footing, so that you don't lose control. The fact that it's well lit, the fact that it's if it's outside, that it's not wet.
Inside or out, keep the workspace dry. Water entering a power tool increases the risk of electrical shock. Do not operate the saw in explosive atmospheres. Sparks from your saw could ignite gases, fumes, or dust in the air. Keep bystanders away from your workspace. Distractions from children, visitors, and pets can cause you to lose control. And of course, never operate a circular saw when tired or while under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or medications.
When a man or a woman's ready to make a cut, we want to make sure that we've got on our eye protection. We want to make sure that there's no loose objects dangling from our clothing or from our body. There's no place on the work site for jewelry that dangles free, or that for loose baggy clothing that might get caught up in moving parts. It's very important to make sure that all of those things are secured away from the saw. It's important to tie back long hair so that we don't have an opportunity for it to either interfere with the work or get drawn into the air intake for cooling the motor. The eyeglasses should be examined closely to assure that they are safety glasses. Typically, the glasses that we wear for seeing are not safety glasses, and we need to look for the ANSI Z87.1 sticker on safety glasses to assure that they have met a standard.
Should conditions dictate, you may also want to consider hearing protection, a dust mask, non-skid safety shoes, and a hard hat. Now, with the work area clean, clutter and distraction-free, and personal attire requirements met, it's time to turn attention to the saw. Always make sure it is in good working order and properly set up before starting a job.
The first thing, you want to make sure that the power cord is intact, it's not frayed, the jacket is not old and cracked, so the electrical safety is taken care of. Then you check the primary safety device is the guard. You make sure that the guard is operating properly.
You should always make sure that the lower guard is operating freely and closing every time. Before every operation, you should make sure that lower guard is closing. Then you also want to make sure that the switch is operating properly so that the tool will shut off after you let go of the trigger.
Inspect the saw for misaligned or broken parts. If there is damage, have the tool serviced before trying to make a cut. Only use accessories designed for your model saw, and never use damaged or incorrect blade washers or bolts. The ones that accompany your saw were designed for optimum performance and maximum safety.
It's very important to pay attention to the routing of the power cord. Not just the routing before you start the cut, but anticipate where you're going to end up to make sure that the cord stays clear throughout the cut. A cord that becomes tangled can disrupt the operation, cause an attention to be drawn away from the cut, or it can literally reroute the saw itself if it's caught on a piece of material that you weren't anticipating. It's always good to make sure that the cord is free and clear throughout the entire run of the cut.
Be sure the switch is off before plugging in the saw to avoid accidental starting. Never run an electrical cord through standing water. And when working outside, be sure to use extension cords marked WA or W. These cords are rated for outdoor use and reduce the risk of electrical shock. And do not alter the plug to make it fit an electrical receptacle. This defeats the safety features incorporated into the electrical system of the saw. Find a different receptacle to use, or have a qualified electrician install the appropriate receptacle. Now, when it comes to setting up or making any adjustments to your saw, do so with the saw disconnected from the power source. Unplug the unit, or in the case of a battery-powered saw, remove the battery. Failure to do so could result in an accidental startup and possible injury.
On a circular saw, there are depth adjustments and bevel adjustments that should be made before you do the cut. The saw blade can be tilted with respect to the top surface of the wood, and that is called a bevel adjustment. You should also adjust the saw blade for a material thickness that you're cutting. The rule of thumb would be that you should not have more blade protruding below the bottom surface of the wood than approximately the height of one tooth. That should be about the maximum exposure below the material.
Finally, be sure the adjustment levers or locks are adequately tightened to prevent the blade shifting or tilting while you are cutting. Now, there are many different types and sizes of circular saw blades, and they're designed for specific materials or types of cutting. You should always use the blade that is designed for your purpose. Be sure the blade is the right size with the correct shape arbor hole. And whatever blade is used, it should always be clean and sharp.
A good sharp blade will help you in a lot of ways. It'll keep a nice clean cut, nice smooth cut. You'll be able to go through the work a lot easier and smoother. It won't tend to slow down on you. A dull blade could help bind up the material when you're cutting, but also a dirty blade, a lot of pitch and stuff stuck on the blade, reduces the amount of space you have left in the kerf, and the binding could occur.
When you're considering the blade to use on a portable circular saw, in addition to making sure that it's the right diameter, that the blade is in good condition, it's sharp, it's not dull, there's no damage to it, particularly if you're looking at carbide tip circular saw blades, that there's no fracture or chipping of those teeth. In addition to that, you want to make sure that the RPM for that blade is proper for the saw. There's a wide variety of blades out there, whether they're steel or carbide or abrasive. Make sure that that speed rating that's on that blade matches, or better yet, exceeds the rating of the circular saw itself.
The single most important thing to remember when you're changing a saw blade is unplug the saw. It's not necessary to have it plugged in to change a blade, and it adds dimensions of safety to the procedure that you really can't do without. Any adjustments that you're doing to a circular saw should be done with the cord unplugged. Most circular saws, if not all, will come with a proprietary wrench for changing the saw blade. Sometimes these wrenches have a storage place on the tool, and sometimes the proper storage place is back in the toolbox. It's important to pay attention to the manufacturer's instructions. If a particular wrench was provided to change the blade on a tool, then that wrench should be used. And the most important aspect is when you're finished changing the blade, that you make sure the wrench is taken off and put back where it belongs and completely away from the saw. Before it's plugged back in, everything needs to be readjusted and assure that the lower guard's still closing and that all the security on the saw, all of the screws and nuts and bolts are retightened the way they were before you started.
Don't forget, circular saws are designed to have the operator hold and guide the saw through the material being cut. So a circular saw should never be mounted in a vise or clamped to a surface in an attempt to convert it into a table saw. This is very, very dangerous. Once you are confident the saw is in good working order and properly set up, the next step is to adequately secure the workpiece. You must never hold a piece being cut in your hands or across your legs.
Security in the workpiece, to me, involves two items. Number one, the fact that the surface that we're actually securing the material to is a stable surface, something that's not subjected to movement, has stability, strength to it. Secondly, that the securing is done by way of a method that indeed is secure, and the only real way to positively do that is through clamping.
You don't put it on a shifty support. On a couple of plastic garbage cans is no good because the material is going to be shifting. Put it on a solid support. Then clamp it down. Make sure that the material, the piece of wood, cannot shift or move away during the cutting operations.
The workpiece itself has got to be examined to make sure that it's straight and that it's knot free. If for some reason I'm using a piece of material that might contain knots, and I know that, then I want to make sure to stage my work, stage my cuts so that I'm avoiding those knots in the workpiece.
As you approach the workpiece ready to make the cut, avoid body contact with grounded surfaces such as pipes, radiators, ranges, and refrigerators. There is an increased risk of electrical shock if your body is grounded. You should be in a balanced, comfortable stance. Your body, hands, and saw should be correctly positioned, so you do not need to overextend or overreach.
You want to stand to either side of the saw. You don't want to stand directly behind it in case you have a kickback or something of that nature, so that it doesn't come back at you and hit you. You want to have your hands on the saw, on the circular saw, and you want to keep them on the auxiliary handle or the side handle or on top of the saw, but nowhere near the cutting area.
The one hand would be on the handle that controls the switch mechanism. And the second hand should always be on the saw in some position. Most saws will have a secondary handle. Sometimes they're called auxiliary handles or additional gripping surfaces. On some products, that gripping surface might be a portion of the saw itself. It might be the motor housing. But there will always be another area where you can put the second hand. A good rule to remember is that if both hands are on the saw, they can't get cut.
Never reach beneath the workpiece. The guard cannot protect you from the exposed blade on the underside of the workpiece.
When you're about ready to make the cut, you want to make sure, first of all, that the saw shoe is flat on the surface that you're cutting, the material that you're cutting. You want to make sure that that blade is not up against the material when you go to trigger or start the saw, that the blade is backed away slightly from the material, and that the blade is up to full speed before you start to make that cut. Determining the right amount of pressure or force to put on the circular saw when you're making the cut is relatively easy because the saw is going to tell you when that pressure is right. If you're getting a reaction from the saw that you're pushing too hard, that it's starting to bind and create a problem, the saw will tell you that. You just have to feel and listen. On the other side of the coin, if you push at a force that allows it to cut the way it wants to cut it, and it's not resisting the cut, if the saw is telling you the entire time you're taking a cut, you just have to pay attention to what it's saying to you. When you've completed the cut, when that blade has finally gotten through the entire width or length of the material, the safest approach to finishing that cut is to allow the saw to come to a complete stop before you draw the saw away from the material or you set it down. If you were to set the saw down while the blade is still coasting to a stop and for some reason the lower guard had been jammed or bound up, then the blade is going to contact that surface that you've set it on, and that saw will very quickly run across that surface, and that obviously creates a lack of control and a potential for injury.
Here's how to safely perform the most common cuts: the cross cut, the rip cut, and the pocket cut.
When you're attempting to cross-cut with a circular saw, in addition to being concerned about the support and the secure clamping of the material as you are in every application, the important thing to do is to make sure that the saw is positioned properly, that the saw shoe, the larger part of it, is positioned on the material rather than the shorter part. That part of the saw shoe should be to the off-fall or the fall-off side of the material, and that you keep the saw shoe flat against the material as you're making the cut. You do not pull that saw shoe up or off of the material at any point in time when you're beginning, making, or completing the cut, and that you make sure that the blade is stopped after you've completed that cut before you remove the saw from the material.
Rip cuts, that is, cutting down the length of the workpiece, are more difficult, requiring greater operator attention over a longer period of time.
You have to make sure that the wood is supported, that the saw is fit for the task that you are about to do. To lay out the work that you want to do, make a pencil mark, use a rip fence or some other device that you would be following whenever possible. Some kind of a straight edge guide would be a good idea if you don't have a rip fence to use during the ripping operation. And again, start the saw up before you engage the blade into the wood, and then push at the steady pace. Whatever the material thickness and the material density will allow you, you will have a feedback from the motor. It will tell you whether you're running at the proper speed, whether you're straining the motor, or you're just taking it too easy. You will, with a little experience in doing the sawing, you will gain that feel for the proper cutting speed.
The most demanding cut is the pocket cut. This cut requires the most attention to details.
One of the more difficult cuts, and possibly one of the most dangerous cuts that you can make with a circular saw, is a pocket cut. A pocket cut is a cut in a piece of material that doesn't begin at the edge of the material but has to be made in the center. For example, if we were cutting out a floor duct in a hardwood floor, and we've got to cut the hole in this particular location, but there's no edge to come to it from. So there is a proper way to make a plunge cut or a pocket cut. To make a pocket cut or a plunge cut with a circular saw, it's necessary to raise the lower blade guard. To do that safely, we would raise the lower blade guard, start the saw, and then ease the saw into the cut. And in this type of cut, in a pocket cut, the nose of the saw or the front edge of the saw is typically supported on the workpiece. Naturally, the workpiece itself is well supported and clamped if necessary, and then the saw with the guard raised is lowered into the cut. As soon as the blade penetrates the cut, the operator's grip on the lever that holds the guard up should be released, and it should allow the guard to close down to cover as much of the blade as might not be in the cut itself.
If you properly control the tool and don't let the guard, or don't expose too much of the blade while you're trying to make your pocket cut, you should be all right. You should only expose as much blade as is necessary to cut into the wood, and then to set the saw into the workpiece, and then let go of the lower guard lift lever and return to controlling the tool with both of your hands.
Anytime that you're making blind cuts with a circular saw into a wall or a ceiling, it's extremely important that you know what's behind that material that you're cutting, and make sure that you're not cutting into either plumbing or, even more significantly, electrical lines that are back there. Obviously, it's not just the potential aggravation of what you've cut into, but the potential danger.
By far, the single biggest problem encountered when using a circular saw is kickback. This is a situation where, for any number of reasons, the blade binds against the material being cut, and the torque of the saw forces the saw out of the cut or kerf and back at the operator. Kickback is dangerous. Do not attempt to recreate the following demonstrations.
If you have an off-fall piece in ripping or in cross-cutting that's large, and as it drops, it's binding on the blade, there's the potential for kickback. Other variables that would affect or create the possibility for kickback could include wet materials, very resinous, green type lumber that would tend to bind up more quickly than drier materials, or encountering something in the cut that creates a problem, whether it be a knot or a nail. Those are the types of things that you could encounter that would create kickback situations.
When the blade is binding or when interrupting a cut for any reason, release the trigger and hold the saw motionless in the material until the blade stops spinning. Never attempt to remove the saw from the workpiece or pull back the saw while the blade is in motion.
At any time that you felt the saw cut was not going properly or the saw was not operating properly, you'd maintain your steady grip with both hands on the saw, release your finger from the trigger, and allow the saw to come to a complete stop before you attempted to repair the problem or remove the saw from the kerf.
When restarting the saw in the workpiece, center the saw teeth in the kerf and check that the teeth are not engaged into the material. Remember, kickback can be controlled. Just make sure the workpiece is properly secured and you are maintaining a solid, balanced stance using a firm two-handed grip on the saw. And finally, even though the job at hand may be complete, you're not finished until you've performed the necessary cleaning and maintenance as prescribed in the owner's manual, and then safely store your saw.
When you're finished using your circular saw, two basic things come to mind as far as what to do with it next. Number one is to unplug it. Don't leave it plugged in, regardless of where it is. Number two, store it away in a place that's dry and out of the reach of children.
The primary focus of your maintenance program should be on operation of the lower guard. That is the number one safety device that you have to watch out for. You have to clean the upper guard, the bearing areas around the lower guard. You have to make sure that the spring that is closing the lower guard is not deformed, it's not clogged with the sawdust, or don't ever remove it from the lower guard. Other areas that you have to pay attention to are to the quality of the bearings. You don't want the bearing on an output spindle to be worn out, because that allows for a saw blade to wander right and left, and that will lead to the not precise cuts. The third areas of focus should be on the quality of the cables, the power cord, to make sure that it's not frayed. Clean it. Do not use solvents like alcohol or maybe gasoline. These chemical agents can attack the power cords, and they can cause degradation in insulating qualities of these cords, and you should not use agents like that. Ammonia is another one that you should not use for cleaning power cords.
And what should you do if your saw needs repair? Well, don't try and service the saw yourself. Have the saw repaired by qualified repair personnel using the proper replacement parts.
When any product needs service, and most especially a cutting tool like a circular saw, you're always well advised to take it back to the manufacturer's authorized service center. These people know how to work on that product correctly, and that's always the best plan, both to maintain your warranty and to maintain a good working product.
Well, that's it for this presentation on circular saw safety. Remember, always read and review the operator's manual that came with your saw. Use it as a reference whenever you have any questions. A circular saw is one of the most popular and useful of all power tools. But don't forget, it can also be one of the most dangerous. However, when your saw is properly used and maintained, the chances of accidental injury are virtually eliminated. That's true whether it's in the home workshop or on the professional construction site. The bottom line is this: with the proper care and attention, circular saw accidents need not happen.